They laughed. Right in front of me. At the gift I spent hours making with love. That moment broke something in me. And what I did next changed everything. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, subscribe to this channel. Every day, we share stories from grandmothers who loved too deeply and were forgotten. My name is Henrietta Lowell, and at 78 years old, I learned that love isn't always enough. Sometimes, it's not even seen. Sometimes, the people you would die for wouldn't even notice if you disappeared tomorrow. This is my story, a story about finding dignity in the darkest moments, about choosing yourself when no one else will, and about discovering that real love was waiting in the most unexpected places all along. It began 6 months before that devastating Christmas morning. I had been planning something special for my grandchildren, something that would show them how much they meant to me. My arthritis had been particularly cruel that autumn, but I persevered through the pain, because love, I believed, could conquer anything. I was knitting scarves, not simple ones, but intricate works of art that took weeks to complete. Each scarf was a different pattern, chosen specifically for each grandchild's personality. For Michael, 16, and always trying to look sophisticated, I chose a complex cable pattern in deep navy wool that cost me 3 weeks of my medication budget. For Sarah, 14 and obsessed with vintage aesthetics, I crafted delicate lace patterns in dusty rose that required me to learn new techniques from library books. The twins, Emma and Ethan, both 12 and inseparable, would receive matching forest green scarves with Celtic knots, a pattern so complex that I had to start over twice when my failing eyesight caused me to make mistakes. But I didn't mind. Each dropped stitch was a sacrifice I gladly made for children I adored from afar. Every evening after my meager pension dinner, usually soup from a can and day-old bread from the discount bakery, I would settle into my threadbare armchair under the single lamp that provided enough light for my old eyes. The apartment would grow cold as I tried to save on heating bills, but my fingers kept working those needles despite the ache that shot through my joints with every movement. Each loop was a prayer for connection. Each row was a whispered hope that maybe this year would be different. Maybe this year they would see me, really see me, not just as the obligation in the corner chair during family gatherings, but as someone who loved them more than life itself. The scarves weren't just accessories to me. They were my heart made tangible, months of my life woven into something I desperately hoped would matter to them. I imagined Michael wearing his to school, friends complimenting the intricate craftsmanship. I pictured Sarah posting photos on her social media, proudly crediting her grandmother's handiwork. I dreamed of the twins wearing their matching scarves on family outings, a visual reminder that someone had taken the time to create something beautiful just for them. But perhaps I should explain how I had become so invisible in the first place. It hadn't happened overnight. Invisibility, I learned, is a gradual process, like losing your hearing or your sight. You don't notice it at first because the changes are so subtle. A conversation that stops when you enter the room. A family photo where somehow there wasn't space for you. A birthday party where you're told, "We didn't think you'd want to come," even though no one had bothered to ask. After my husband Harold died 7 years ago, I had expected my relationship with David and his family to grow closer. I thought grief might bring us together, that they might need me as much as I needed them. Instead, the opposite happened. Without Harold as a bridge between us, I became increasingly peripheral to their lives. David, my only child, was busy climbing the corporate ladder at his law firm. Jennifer, his wife, was consumed with maintaining their perfect suburban lifestyle and managing the children's packed schedules of activities I was never invited to attend. The grandchildren saw me as an outdated relic who didn't understand their world of technology and designer brands. I tried everything to stay connected. I remembered every birthday, sent cards for every holiday, offered to babysit whenever they needed help. When David mentioned needing money for Michael's orthodontics, I quietly took out a loan against my small life insurance policy to help. When Jennifer complained about the cost of Sarah's dance classes, I sold my mother's antique jewelry to contribute to the fees. But none of these gestures seemed to register. The money was accepted without much acknowledgement, as if it was expected rather than appreciated. My offers to help were politely declined with vague excuses about being too busy or my apartment being too small for the children to be comfortable. The worst part was the family photos. For years, I had been gradually edited out of their visual history. First, I was moved to the edges of group shots, then relegated to separate photos that somehow never made it into frames or albums. Eventually, I stopped being included at all. When I asked David about it, he would mumble something about the photographer being rushed or the children being restless. I began to understand that I had become what sociologists call socially dead, technically alive but functionally invisible to the people who were supposed to matter most. The scarves were my desperate attempt to break through that invisibility. If I could create something beautiful enough, meaningful enough, surely they would have to acknowledge me. Surely handmade gifts infused with months of love and labor would penetrate their indifference. I was so very wrong. Christmas morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. David picked me up in his luxury sedan, the same one I had helped finance 2 years earlier when his previous car needed major repairs. He barely helped me with my gift bag, more focused on checking his phone messages than ensuring his elderly mother didn't slip on the icy walkway. Jennifer sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through social media and responding to messages with the kind of urgency she never showed when I called her. She offered a perfunctory, "Morning, Mom," without looking up from her screen, then immediately returned to her digital world where I didn't exist. The drive to their house was silent, except for the hum of the expensive sound system playing music I didn't recognize. I clutched my carefully wrapped gifts and tried to summon excitement for what I hoped would be a magical morning. After all, wasn't Christmas supposed to be about family, about gratitude, about remembering what truly mattered? Their house had been transformed into something worthy of a magazine spread. Every surface gleamed with imported decorations, hand-blown ornaments from Germany, garland that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a 12-foot tree that dominated their cathedral ceiling living room. Everything was perfect, polished, and completely untouchable, much like the family itself. I was directed to my chair, the uncomfortable armchair positioned slightly apart from the main seating area where the real family gathered. It wasn't officially designated as mine, but over the years it had become understood that this was where Grandma Henrietta belonged. Close enough to witness the festivities, but far enough away not to interfere with the perfect family tableau. From my peripheral position, I watched the Christmas morning chaos unfold with the practiced observation of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. The grandchildren moved with the efficiency of seasoned gift-opening professionals, tearing through professionally wrapped packages with barely contained greed. Gaming systems worth thousands of dollars. Designer clothes with price tags that made my pension seem like pocket change. The latest smartphones and tablets and devices whose names I didn't even recognize. Jewelry that sparkled under the expensive lighting. Everything they opened was met with shrieks of delight, immediate photography for social media documentation, and breathless thank yous directed exclusively toward Mom and Dad. I noticed that none of the children asked about gifts from other relatives. There were no packages from Jennifer's parents, who lived across the country and sent generous checks instead of personal gifts. No offerings from David's cousins or his few remaining aunts and uncles. It was as if the entire extended family had been reduced to monetary contributions rather than personal connections. The commercial frenzy lasted nearly 2 hours, with wrapping paper creating mountains of expensive waste that would fill several garbage bags. The children immediately began using their new devices, their attention completely absorbed by screens and gadgets that promised instant gratification. When the last store-bought gift had been opened and admired, when the children had begun to lose interest in their bounty, I quietly stood and retrieved my humble offering from beside my chair. The brown paper bag looked pathetic next to the professionally wrapped packages that had preceded it. I had used gift wrap from last year's Christmas, carefully saved and pressed smooth, tied with ribbon I had collected from previous occasions. Nothing fancy, but packed with more love than any store-bought present in that spotless room. "I have something for you, children," I said softly, my voice almost lost in the post-unwrapping chatter and the electronic sounds of newly activated games. Michael looked up from his gaming headset with the kind of barely concealed impatience teenagers reserve for interruptions from irrelevant adults. Sarah paused her frantic social media photography session, sighing slightly at the disruption. The twins stopped comparing their identical smartwatches long enough to glance in my direction with polite but distant attention. My hands trembled slightly as I reached into my bag. The scarves had been wrapped individually in tissue paper I had saved from other occasions, each one carefully folded to show the intricate patterns I had worked so hard to perfect. I handed Michael his navy scarf first, explaining how I had chosen the cable pattern because it reminded me of the sweaters he used to admire when we watched old movies together. Back when he was small enough to curl up next to me on the couch, back when my presence in his life was welcome rather than tolerated. "I spent weeks learning this pattern just for you," I told him, my voice thick with emotion I tried to contain. The cables represent strength and connection, and I thought, but Michael's expression stopped me mid-sentence. He held up the scarf with the kind of look you might give a dead fish, examining it as if it were a curiosity from another century. The navy wool that had cost me so much looked suddenly shabby in his manicured hands. "A scarf," he said flatly, his tone conveying everything he couldn't say directly in front of the adults. He looked at his sister with the expression that made my chest tighten with dread. Sarah took her dusty rose scarf with the delicate lace pattern and held it at arm's length, studying it with the critical eye of someone accustomed to designer accessories. The hours I had spent learning the complicated lace technique suddenly seemed foolish and naive. "It's so homemade," she whispered to Emma, but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. The word homemade dripped with the kind of disdain usually reserved for something truly offensive. The twins accepted their matching Celtic knot scarves with the polite resignation of children who had been taught to be gracious even when receiving something they considered worthless. Emma held hers up briefly, then let it fall into her lap with a soft thud that might as well have been a gavel pronouncing judgment on my efforts. Ethan managed a perfunctory, "Thanks, Grandma," but the words were delivered with the hollow politeness children use when adults force them to express gratitude for something they find embarrassing. Then it happened, the moment that would haunt me for weeks afterward. Michael caught Sarah's eye and smirked. Not a cruel smile exactly, but the kind of expression that passes between teenagers who share a private joke at an adult's expense. Sarah's lips twitched with suppressed laughter. The twins, always quick to follow their older siblings' lead, exchanged glances and began to giggle. The laughter started small, just quiet snickering behind hands and barely audible whispers. But it grew, fed by the kind of pack mentality that makes children cruel without fully understanding the damage they're causing. "Grandma's crafty corner strikes again," Michael muttered, loud enough for his siblings to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if the adults questioned him. "At least they're warm," Sarah added with fake sincerity that somehow made her words more cutting than outright mockery would have been. "Maybe we can use them as dust rags?" Emma suggested, which sent Ethan into barely controlled giggles. They weren't being deliberately vicious. They were just being thoughtless in the way that young people often are, dismissing something they couldn't understand or appreciate. But their casual cruelty hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, watching the love I had knitted into every stitch be dismissed as an inconvenience, a source of amusement, something to be endured rather than treasured. The scarves lay abandoned on the floor like discarded dreams, already forgotten as the children returned to their expensive toys and electronic devices. The room continued its celebration around me, but I had become completely invisible again, not just overlooked, but actively dismissed. I was the old woman in the corner chair with her quaint, outdated gestures of affection, her pathetic attempts to remain relevant in a world that had moved beyond her. Jennifer finally looked up from her phone, perhaps sensing some shift in the room's energy. "Oh, Mom," she said with the patronizing tone she might use with a confused child. "You really shouldn't have spent money on yarn when you're on such a fixed income. Maybe next year you could just get them gift cards instead. You know how kids are these days. They prefer to choose their own things." The suggestion hit me like a slap. Gift cards. Impersonal, convenient, forgettable gift cards that required no thought, no effort, no love. Just money transferred from my meager account to their abundant ones. Another transaction in a relationship that had been reduced to financial exchanges. David nodded absently, already helping Michael set up his new gaming system, his attention completely absorbed by the complex electronics that would provide hours of entertainment without requiring any human connection. That's a good idea, Jan. Much more practical. None of them noticed the tears threatening to spill from my eyes or how my hands trembled as I folded them in my lap and tried to disappear even further into my corner chair. They didn't see how their casual dismissal had shattered something fundamental inside me. Not just my hope for this Christmas, but my faith in the entire relationship I had been desperately trying to maintain. That moment crystallized years of small hurts I had tried to rationalize and ignore. Every birthday party where I learned about the celebration after seeing photos on social media. Every school play or sports event where I wasn't invited because we didn't think you'd be interested or it's going to be really crowded. Every family vacation planned without consulting me. Every holiday tradition that evolved to exclude me. Every conversation that stopped when I entered the room. I had always told myself that love meant showing up anyway, giving anyway, hoping anyway. I had convinced myself that persistence would eventually be rewarded, that my devotion would eventually be acknowledged and reciprocated. But sitting in that perfect living room, watching my grandchildren laugh at the only gifts I could afford to give, I realized I had been living in a fantasy. The truth was much simpler and more painful. I had been loving an idea of family that didn't include me. They didn't want my handmade gifts because they didn't want a relationship with me that required effort or emotional investment. They preferred the distance that money could provide, clean, simple transactions that didn't require them to acknowledge my humanity or my needs. The rest of Christmas morning passed in a haze of forced normalcy. I smiled when expected, nodded at conversations I wasn't really included in, and quietly helped clear dishes while everyone else relaxed in the living room, absorbed in their new acquisitions. The scarves remained on the floor, occasionally kicked aside as people moved around the room, until Jennifer finally gathered them up and set them on a side table, for later. When David drove me home that evening, I thanked him for the lovely day with the same hollow politeness his children had used with me. The words felt like ash in my mouth, but I had learned long ago that expressing hurt or disappointment would only make me seem demanding and ungrateful. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during those hours of observation and rejection. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something else, a cold, clear understanding of my situation that felt almost liberating in its brutal honesty. I was not wanted. I was not valued. I was not seen as a person deserving of respect or consideration. I was an obligation to be managed, a source of guilt to be assuaged with minimal effort, a relic from an earlier generation that had outlived its usefulness. This realization should have destroyed me. Instead, it began to set me free. The next morning, I woke up in my small apartment with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The tears had stopped sometime during the night, replaced by a calm determination that surprised me with its strength. I made my morning tea, sat at my tiny kitchen table, and began to think about what I really wanted from the years I had left. For so long, my life had been organized around other people's needs and schedules. I had shaped myself into whatever they seemed to want, the grateful recipient of their occasional attention, the source of emergency funds when they needed financial help, the convenient babysitter when their regular arrangements fell through. I had made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that if I required less space, they might find room for me in their busy lives. But what if I stopped trying to fit into spaces where I wasn't wanted? What if I started living for myself instead of for the approval of people who would never give it? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I called my lawyer, Mr. Patterson, who had handled my simple affairs for years. His secretary was surprised to hear from me so early in the morning, but she scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I need to change my will, I told him when I arrived at his modest office downtown. Mr. Patterson, a kind man in his 60s who had always treated me with genuine respect, looked concerned. Of course, Mrs. Lowell. What modifications would you like to make? I had spent hours thinking about this decision, examining it from every angle, considering the consequences and my motivations. For years, my will had been simple. Everything I owned would go to my grandchildren's college funds. It wasn't much by their family's standards, about $30,000 accumulated through decades of careful budgeting and sacrifice. but it represented every small denial I had made, every dinner of soup instead of meat, every winter coat worn for another year, every small luxury foregone so I could leave something meaningful behind. But now I understood that my money, like my gifts, would be received without gratitude or acknowledgement. It would be absorbed into their already comfortable lives without making any real difference. Another anonymous contribution to their prosperity that would be quickly forgotten. "I want to leave everything to Leticia Santos," I said quietly. "She's my cleaning lady." Mr. Patterson's pen paused mid-sentence. He looked up at me with the careful expression lawyers use when they think a client might be making a decision they'll regret. "Mrs. Lowell, this is quite a significant change from your previous will. Are you certain this is what you want to do?" I thought of Leticia, who came to my apartment twice a week to help me maintain the small space that had become my entire world. She was a single mother in her 40s, working multiple jobs to support her teenage daughter Maria and send money to her elderly parents in El Salvador. Despite her own struggles, Leticia treated me with a kindness and respect that my own family had never shown. Unlike my blood relatives, Leticia saw me as a person worth knowing. She noticed when I was having a particularly bad day with my arthritis and would quietly take over the heavier cleaning tasks without making me feel helpless or burdensome. She remembered that I liked my tea with honey instead of sugar, that I preferred the curtains open during the day for natural light, that I got anxious when my few remaining houseplants weren't properly watered. When I gave Leticia small gifts, a scarf I had knitted, leftover cookies from a batch I had made, a book I had enjoyed and thought she might like, she received them like precious treasures. Her eyes would light up with genuine pleasure, and she would thank me with a sincerity that made me feel valuable and appreciated again. More importantly, Leticia talked to me, not at me, not past me, but to me. She asked about my day, my health, my memories of Harold, and the life we had built together. She told me about Maria's achievements in school, her own struggles to balance work and family, her dreams of one day saving enough money to bring her parents to visit from Central America. Our conversations had become the highlights of my week, real exchanges between two women who understood life's challenges and appreciated each other's company. With Leticia, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a burden or an obligation. I was simply Henrietta, a person worthy of friendship and respect. "I'm absolutely certain," I told Mr. Patterson. "Leticia is the only person who has consistently treated me with kindness and dignity. She's the one who deserves to benefit from what I've saved." Mr. Patterson made a note in his file, then looked at me with compassion. "Mrs. Lowell, I have to ask, have you discussed this decision with your son? This will likely come as quite a shock to your family." I considered his question seriously. The old me would have worried about David's reaction, would have anticipated his hurt and anger and tried to find a way to soften the blow. But the new me, the one who had been born in that perfect living room while my grandchildren laughed at my gifts, felt only a calm certainty. "My family made their feelings about me very clear yesterday," I said simply. "They don't value what I have to offer while I'm alive. I see no reason they should benefit from my death." Over the following weeks, I began making other changes to my life, small adjustments that felt revolutionary after years of living according to other people's expectations and schedules. I downsized to an even smaller apartment in a senior-friendly building with better security and lower maintenance costs. The move required giving up most of my furniture, but I found the process liberating rather than sad. Each item I donated was something I no longer had to dust, organize, or worry about. My new space was compact but entirely mine, arranged according to my preferences rather than someone else's idea of how I should live. The money I saved on rent and utilities allowed me small luxuries I had denied myself for years. I bought better quality tea, fresh flowers for my kitchen table, books I actually wanted to read rather than borrowing worn copies from the library. I invested in better yarn for my knitting projects and discovered the pleasure of creating beautiful things purely for my own satisfaction. I joined a crafts circle at the community center, where I met other women my age who shared my interests and understood my experiences. Martha, a retired teacher, had a sharp wit and an extensive collection of mystery novels she was happy to share. Helen, a former nurse, taught me to embroider and shared stories from her decades of caring for others. Dorothy, a widow like myself, had a gift for making everyone laugh, even when discussing life's difficulties. For the first time in years, I was part of a group where I felt valued and appreciated. These women listened when I spoke, remembered details about my life, and included me in their plans and conversations. We met for coffee, attended matinee movies, and celebrated each other's small victories and milestones. The scarves I now knitted went to the homeless shelter downtown, where they were received with the kind of genuine gratitude I had foolishly expected from my grandchildren. The volunteers told me stories about the people who received my gifts, how much they appreciated handmade items, how rare it was for someone to take such personal care with donations, how the warmth of a hand-knitted scarf could make the difference between comfort and misery during cold winter nights. My relationship with Letitia and her family deepened as well. When Maria graduated high school with honors despite the challenges of being raised by a single working mother, I attended her graduation ceremony. It was the first time in years that I had been invited to celebrate a young person's achievement, and I was moved to tears by the pride and joy I felt watching her walk across that stage. The ceremony reminded me painfully of all the graduations, recitals, and sporting events I had missed in my own grandchildren's lives, not because I wasn't invited, but because no one had thought to include me. But instead of dwelling on those losses, I focused on the present moment and the genuine connection I felt with this remarkable young woman who had overcome so much to achieve her dreams. When Letitia worried about affording Maria's college textbooks and supplies, I quietly helped with what I could spare from my pension. Not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to invest in the future of someone who had brought so much light into my life. The money felt well spent, in a way that my contributions to my own grandchildren's expensive lifestyle never had. As the months passed, my new life took on a rhythm and richness that surprised me. The crafts circle became a source of real friendship and community. We supported each other through health scares, family dramas, and the ordinary challenges of aging. We celebrated birthdays, shared holiday meals, and created the kind of chosen family that many people never experience. I discovered interests and talents I had suppressed for years while trying to remain relevant to my biological family. I learned to paint watercolors, joined a book club, and even tried my hand at writing poetry. None of these activities were particularly skillful or noteworthy, but they brought me joy and a sense of personal growth that had been missing from my life for far too long. My family, predictably, barely noticed the changes in my circumstances. David called occasionally out of duty, usually when Jennifer reminded him that he hadn't spoken to his mother in several weeks. These conversations were brief and superficial, focused on my health and living arrangements rather than my emotional well-being or the new relationships I was building. Jennifer sent obligatory cards for my birthday and Christmas, signed with generic messages that could have been written to any elderly relative. The grandchildren never called or visited, apparently content to let their parents handle the minimal maintenance of our relationship. None of them asked about the scarves I had made, which I later learned from a casual comment by David had been donated to charity shortly after Christmas. They had never even been tried on, much less worn or appreciated. The months of work, the financial sacrifice, the love and hope I had poured into every stitch, all of it had been discarded as casually as the expensive wrapping paper from their store-bought gifts. But I was no longer waiting for their acknowledgement or approval. I had found something more valuable than their conditional acceptance, my own dignity and self-respect. The turning point came almost exactly 1 year after that devastating Christmas morning. Letitia knocked on my door with a package wrapped in simple brown paper, her face glowing with excitement and anticipation. "Maria made this for you," she said, her eyes bright with the kind of pride only a mother can feel. "She's been working on it for weeks, watching YouTube videos and asking me to help her when she got stuck." Inside the carefully wrapped package was a scarf, not perfectly even like my practiced stitches, but made with the careful attention and determination of someone learning to love through creation. The yarn was soft and luxurious, in a beautiful shade of lavender that complemented my silver hair perfectly. "She picked the color herself," Letitia explained, her voice thick with emotion. "She said it would bring out your eyes and make you look like the elegant lady you are." I held that imperfect, beautiful scarf and felt my heart swell with the kind of love I had almost forgotten existed. The kind that flows in both directions, that sees and appreciates, that values the giver as much as the gift. This simple piece of knitting represented something my own grandchildren had never understood, that the love behind a gift matters more than its monetary value or technical perfection. Maria appeared in my doorway, shy but proud, her teenage awkwardness temporarily forgotten in her excitement to see my reaction. "Do you like it, Senora Henrietta? I know I'm still learning, and it's not as good as the ones you make, but Mama said you taught yourself to knit when you were young, so I thought I could learn too." I wrapped that lovely, talented girl in a hug, the scarf still clutched in my trembling hands. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me," I whispered against her hair, and I meant every single word. That evening, I sat in my cozy apartment, wearing Maria's scarf and reflecting on the strange turns my life had taken. The walls were now decorated with pictures from the crafts circle, thank you notes from the homeless shelter volunteers, and a framed photo of Maria's graduation day where I stood proudly beside her and Letitia, finally included in a family portrait that mattered. My small kitchen table held fresh flowers, good books, and a cup of premium tea that I had bought without guilt or second thoughts about the expense. The scarves I was currently knitting, one for Helen's new grandchild, another for the shelter's winter drive, lay nearby, each stitch infused with genuine love and purpose rather than desperate hope for acceptance. I thought about my biological grandchildren, now older and presumably still receiving expensive gifts they barely remembered a week later. I felt no bitterness toward them, only a quiet sadness for what they were missing, the joy of truly connecting with another person, the satisfaction of creating something meaningful with their own hands, the warmth that comes from genuine gratitude and reciprocal love. My phone sat silent on its charger, as it usually did. David might call on my birthday if Jennifer remembered to remind him. The grandchildren would continue their busy lives, surrounded by material abundance, but perhaps starved for the kind of authentic connection that makes life truly rich. But I was no longer waiting by that phone, hoping for crumbs of attention from people who had made it clear they didn't really want me in their lives. I had learned to find love and meaning in unexpected places, to recognize genuine affection in the patient hands that helped me with heavy lifting, in the young woman who struggled through her first knitting project because she wanted to give me something special, in the circle of friends who gathered each week to share stories, skills, and the kind of mutual support that creates real family. At 79, I finally understood that love isn't about giving everything you have to people who don't value it. Love is about recognizing your own worth and sharing yourself with those who can appreciate the gift of your presence in their lives. The laughter that had once broken my heart now seemed like a distant memory from another lifetime, replaced by the gentle warmth of genuine connection and mutual respect. Maria's scarf around my shoulders felt like a blessing, a tangible reminder that I was seen, valued, and loved for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide or how well I could adapt to someone else's expectations. Tomorrow, I would start a new knitting project, maybe mittens for the shelter's children's program, or perhaps a baby blanket for Helen's daughter who was expecting her first child. Whatever I created, it would be received with the kind of gratitude that transforms both giver and receiver, the kind of appreciation that makes every stitch worthwhile. For the first time in my long life, I was no longer invisible. I had simply been looking for love in the wrong places, accepting crumbs when I deserved a feast. Now, surrounded by people who truly saw and valued me, I finally understood what it meant to be cherished for my authentic self rather than tolerated as an obligation. And that understanding, I realized as I pulled Maria's beautiful scarf closer around my shoulders, was worth more than all the expensive gifts and empty gestures in the world. At 79, I had finally learned to choose myself, and in doing so, I had found the real family I had been searching for all along. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that deserve to be heard. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one.